Hello, and welcome to today's topic, Canada-U.S. relations on fishing. They say there are plenty of fish in the sea, and that's exactly why fishing has been a source of contention for Canada and the U.S. for centuries. Though Canada and the U.S. cooperate on the issue of fishing, each state has internal infrastructure that is assigned the task of managing fishing. In Canada, the main actors are the federal government, Jonathan Wilkinson, the current Ministers of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, and the Department of Fishing, otherwise known as the DFO. Meanwhile, the U.S. employs its own government, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service paralleling Canada's DFO, U.S. Border Control, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection.
The Canada-U.S. relationship in fishing is characterized by a succession of shifts between nationalist and continentalist approaches. The nationalist approach denotes a state-centric take on bilateral relations, whereas the continental approach fosters cooperation between Canada and the U.S., especially in reference to the use of shared resources. In the early days of Canada-U.S. relations regarding fishing has changed from the continentalist ideology to nationalist motives and back to continentalism. The first wave of continentalism was codified in the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, as the U.S. was granted equal rights with British subjects to fish in the waters of British North America, what is now the Atlantic Ocean. The United States begins to shift towards nationalism in the late 1800s, but the continentalist approaches to fishing were restored by the early 1900s. After over a century of developing continental ties between Canada and the U.S., the Depression landed a solid blow on both countries' fishing markets. World War I and World War II led to an emphasis on productivity and the development of both countries' fishing industries. The emphasis on efficiency from Canada and the United States led to overfishing, which created the need to develop comprehensive management of catch in shared waters. Canada established the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which linked to the United States' Fish and Wildlife Services to resolve the problems. Both sides introduced catch and license limits, conservation quotas, and fishing zones to divide livestock. The strategy worked, which has motivated Canada and the United States to develop modern agreements that prevent overfishing while ensuring strong production, such as the Pacific Salmon Treaty.
On the one hand, the Canadian side recognizes the centrality of continentalism in the issue of fishing and broadly shared resources such as clean air and the environment. At this point in time, climate change is at an unprecedented level of concern in Canada, reinforcing the Canadian perspective that sharing the onus of codifying fish regulations is the appropriate perspective on the issue. On the other hand, the U.S. Border Patrol has engaged in offensive actions, forcing Canada into a defensive position. For example, in 2018, at least 10 incidents were recorded wherein Canadian fishing boats from New Brunswick were intercepted by U.S. Border Patrol. This leads to the question of whether it is beneficial for Canadian interests to lean towards a more nationalistic approach. But, as of 2015, fishing and seafood exports constituted the second largest Canadian source of revenue, bringing in an annual figure of $6 billion. To turn a cold shoulder to the U.S. when dealing with such a vital industry, especially when fish are a shared resource, would be harmful to Canadian interests. Thus, the Canadian approach to fishing remains continentalist.
The United States' position is that it does not accept the gray zone of shared waters inherited from Britain. As a result, both countries claim sovereignty of the waters between the two. Proof that the gray zone is not accepted is the increase of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol agents in the water and their interactions with Canadian fishermen. Extensively. If Canada were to challenge the control of international waters, including fishing, the United States could perceive this as a challenge to their sovereignty. Although this would lead the United States to take a nationalistic approach, the U.S. is aware that Canada is their second largest trading partner. By failing to operate bilaterally in shared waters, the United States would become predominantly subject to the wills of Canadian fisheries, which would result in a decrease of harvest for the U.S., creating an economic downturn in the fishing sector. Therefore, it is best for the U.S. to proceed with continental attitudes towards fishing in shared waters.
Overall, bilateral treaties and relations have dominated the realm of fishing as both Canada and the U.S. have been cooperative with each other and other actors. This reflects a general focus on continentalism. Some bilateral successes include the Pacific Salmon Commission, a third-party institution designed to enforce various bilateral agreements regarding salmon fishing. Both Canada and the U.S. are afforded the opportunity to appoint representatives to the Commission, which is responsible for the renewal of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. Moving forward, the Pacific Salmon Commission is in discussions for the renewal of Chapter 4 of the treaty, which expires on December 31, 2019. Likely influences on the renewal include a heightened focus on the effects of climate change and the upcoming federal elections of both Canada and the U.S. Overall, it is true that there are plenty of fish in the sea, and it is apparent that both Canada and the U.S. are willing and able to cooperate to catch and protect them.